Welcome to Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva. Today we have an interesting guest joining us. We have a gentleman who has authored a book on Robert Kennedy and the shaping of the civil rights, 1960 to 1964. As you can see it here and there, cross promotion. We welcome to the program adjunct professor at Quinnipiac University of History, and also he teaches U.S. history at Summers High School in Summers, Connecticut, and has worked as a freelance reporter for 2 newspapers and resides here in our state of Connecticut. Adjunct Professor Philip A. Goduti Jr., welcome to the program. Nice to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
That's great. Great to have you here. Again, being not quite a relic yet, but slightly older than perhaps some of our viewers, I do recall some of these events, not necessarily the early 60s, but from the middle to the later 60s, some of the turmoil and some of the things that went on in what many consider to be quite a remarkable decade. So again, I'll share a few insights that I recall of different things, but you've written a very interesting book. As I told Phil off air, I felt like I had taken a 3-credit history course in the course of a few days that I read the book. So
thank you. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing more things from you. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, this book really came out of my first book. The first book that I wrote about was about John F. Kennedy and how his advisors had influenced him with his foreign policy. And one of the advisors that I kept coming back to was Bobby Kennedy. Now, I had always known that Bobby Kennedy was involved in the administration. I didn't realize just how closely he was involved with his brother in shaping policy for the country. In the midst of that research, I found a lot of documents pertaining to civil rights, and especially the work that he did with Burke Marshall, who was the Assistant Attorney General and really focused on civil rights. So from that, I started to explore his role in shaping that aspect of the Kennedy administration.
One thing, and again, this perspective from this point in time, again, is from obviously a later high school or college, a history student and a person that, enjoyed reading books about history. I can remember reading a great biography in the late 60s, early 70s about, Lyndon Johnson and stuff, and Martin Luther King, of course, after his untimely death, assassination. But what I got, and of course then, sometimes it's revisionist history or new things are found out that are, that you would know now that they didn't know then, was that I got the impression in those early years that the Kennedys, were kind of almost hands-off on civil rights. So obviously I was misinformed or misled, but maybe as the years went on, kind of the little nuggets came out that really there was a lot of involvement led by Robert F. Kennedy.
And that's still the prevailing feeling among a lot of historians. What this book tries to illustrate is that America in the 1960s was really at a crossroads. And civil rights was one of the many issues that we had been dealing with since the end of the Civil War, since even before the Civil War. So when we're looking at what role the Kennedys played in that cause, what we're seeing is not necessarily action as much as the changing of the climate of this country, where we go from a country in the late 50s, 1960 election, where civil rights was sort of the third rail of politics, to, in 1964, embracing civil rights with the Civil Rights Act, among other things, and then the Voting Rights Act in the next year. So what the Kennedys did was, by seeing civil rights as an issue instead of this third rail in politics, they started to awaken the country to the injustice that was going on in the South. And they had done that in a variety of ways. Probably the largest way that they did it was in the Civil Rights speech in June of 1963. But all the events leading up to that speech played a role in finding a good way to approach civil rights, not necessarily as a political issue anymore, but as a moral issue, and something that had to do with right and wrong. And what the book tries to illustrate is that this isn't something that happens overnight. It's not that the Civil Rights Act wasn't a momentous act. and that Lyndon Johnson shouldn't get credit for it. It's that there were things leading up to that act that absolutely played a role in its passage, and absolutely played a role in the American people accepting it as a norm instead of something that they had previously not seen as an issue, even here in the North, not only in the South, in the segregationist states. So,
one thing, and again, it's not necessarily touched on heavily in the book, but of course, growing up, and I'm sure you knew this from going as a young boy to school yourself, the 50s, you always hear the 50s as, oh, the great decade of, affluence, prosperity, post-war. And of course, there's a lot of underlying, things that are going on that are not necessarily all that rosy. But overall, people, had the new refrigerator and television was coming out, or, prospering, and people, building their little, family homes. But that Eisenhower decade, as two terms, is looked at as, oh, this tremendous, point in our history, and in some ways it was. But looking at this here, it amazed me that for all the great things that Eisenhower did, such as our highway system or whatever, but when it came to civil rights, other than the Brown versus Brown Act of the Board of Ed in 1954, there wasn't a lot of strides made.
No, and when you're looking at Eisenhower, he was very big in seeing that the federal government had a certain amount of power, and the states were supposed to have power over their localities, especially in the South. And he didn't like Brown versus the Board of Ed because he felt that it gave too much power to the federal government. I mean, he intervened in Little Rock with the 101st Airborne, but other than that, Eisenhower tried to stay away from civil rights. And at first, so did Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, when he was managing the campaign in 1960, it was during the sit-in movement, Martin Luther King had been arrested. And John F. Kennedy was speaking with one of his advisors, Sergeant Shriver, who's also his brother-in-law. And I believe it was Shriver who said, look, you may just want to give his wife a call. She's pregnant, she's distraught, we don't know what's going on with King. So John F. Kennedy gives Martin Luther King a call. When Bobby Kennedy finds out about this, he is enraged at the fact that one of the advisors had given this nominee for the presidency this idea to call a civil rights leader. And in the South at the time, a lot of these segregationist governors would not support anyone who supported civil rights. So John Kennedy went a little bit out on a limb by doing that. But when it came down to it, Bobby Kennedy saw the injustice behind what was going on with King. And he ends up calling the judge who refused to give bail to Martin Luther King because it was the right thing to do. But it took him a moment to process the injustice, which I think you see in that brief glimpse a little bit of what he went through when he was Attorney General.
Right.
Because he experiences the injustice through the Freedom Rides. He sees it with Ole Miss. He sees it with Birmingham and the integration of the University of Alabama. And it's him who goes to John Kennedy and says, look, we have to speak out on this. We're not on the right side of history if we don't. And it did take a little while, but it's not that dissimilar to how Lincoln handled slavery during the Civil War. I mean, he didn't issue the Emancipation Proclamation until 2 years into the war, and had said on several occasions, if saving the Union meant keeping slavery, I would do it. But when he saw the opportunity, he used his power as president, and he freed the slaves only in the South. But still, nevertheless, it set the necessary road to eventually lead to the 13th Amendment, which would, of course, abolish slavery throughout the land.
Just to touch, and again, I'm throwing some of these things out because, again, even folks like myself, as you're reading this, you're reminded, because we think in terms of, here and now, and something you mentioned about, doing something, in the South. Well, in those years, again, of Lincoln, there was no West Coast, there was no Arizona. I mean, some of these areas may have been, being whatever, prospectors, whatever, but there was no states, or there might have been a few territories here or there. But again, that's how that was. Just like, as I was reminded or refreshed as I'm reading now, circa 1960, and we'll see a couple of photos of, like these atrocities happening with, with guard dogs and hoses being turned on people. I mean, does some of that still happen today? Well, all we have to do is pick up our daily paper, and to a different extent, because of I think social media and everything is captured on someone's phone or whatever. But again, there's still a lot of issues even today going on that I was reminded of when I was reading this. Now again, they say there's no whatever prejudice to know this or know that, but again, you'd be hard pressed to, again, with some of the African American civil rights groups, that the question always comes up, well, what would Martin Luther King say today? And he would probably say, it's always been the common thread, oh, there's still work to be done.
And I think that's something that we've seen throughout the history of the civil rights movement, going back to just after the Civil War in the Age of Reconstruction, with several civil rights leaders over the year, everyone from Booker T. Washington to W.B. Du Bois, to, of course, the early years of the Congress of Racial Equality in the 1940s, who did the original Freedom Rides. And this is a chapter in the overarching cause. That's how I see it. Yep. And the civil rights movement is something that is very pervasive and has been with us for a very long time. You can even argue since the inception of the Republic, going all the way back to the American Revolution, even before. But it's something that we have to constantly examine. And what I see this as is a chapter in that cause and a contribution on the part of the Kennedys, which would eventually lead up to the contribution of the Civil Rights Act, which we still use today.
Right.
Of course, the contribution of people like Dr. King, people like John Lewis, and James Meredith, who put themselves out there to try to change something in this country. So I see that as one part of a much larger story that involves not only African Americans, but also other groups. And what the 1960s really serves as is a springboard to see these other rights movements begin throughout the country. And that's why I even want to put more emphasis on the fact that the Kennedys changed the climate in this nation. Maybe not necessarily with their immediate action, but definitely with their rhetoric, and definitely with their ideas, and how those ideas eventually become reality with different legislation. Maybe not with Jack and Bobby, but especially with Ted, later on. So that's how I see this coming out in the long run and playing a role in history.
We're talking with Philip A. Goduti Jr., again, adjunct professor at Quinnipiac University, who's written a great book, Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of Civil Rights, 1960 to 1964. And again, as we discussed earlier, again, those years kind of, again, the maturing, if you want to call it, of, again, Robert F. Kennedy, and not only what he and his brother did, but also kind of where his fervent, attitude changed towards civil rights. Because in the early years, even when he was on committees and prior to his brother being elected, he was about, well, what, the letter of the law, and then sometimes there's, gray areas, not to bend the law, but in terms of how it impacts people. And I think then he came to realize that, as the years went on. Certainly there was a chapter, and I'll just jump to it because it came to mind right now. I want to say about 1963, June perhaps, the Kennedy, probably still do, had an apartment in New York and had a meeting with people like Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne, people, affluent entertainers, people of a literary note, and he was floored that, in other words, their attitude to him was, well, you haven't done anything, you haven't done enough.
Yeah, that meeting was very eye-opening for Bobby Kennedy. And from his perspective, one of the things that he always used to say was that his ancestors had been discriminated against when they came over to this country. And there's, of course, some truth in that, but not like African Americans, not even close. But a lot of African Americans took that and were almost insulted by it, because we're looking at African Americans can trace their ancestry back to slaves, where the Kennedys could not. And the Kennedys had been in this country, their families have been in this country in a much shorter time and had done more, as opposed to African Americans who have been here since 1619, when the first slave ship came into Jamestown. So he was appalled by that. Part of that is his upbringing, because he did have an entitled upbringing, obviously, with his wealth. and everything that he was afforded. The other part of it was he honestly believed he was doing more than any other attorney general had for African Americans.
Which he probably was, yeah.
He was. He absolutely was. If you look at the history of civil rights and the role that the attorney general played in any sort of civil rights legislation or any sort of civil rights intervention, you almost see none. And he is a very active attorney general in those 3 years where, well, he was in after his brother was assassinated, right. But even that year was a very difficult year for Bobby Kennedy. But he had done a lot, but he hadn't done enough from the civil rights leaders' perspectives. So he took some level of insult from that, but on the flip side of that, it also motivated him to do something more, and that eventually leads up to John F. Kennedy's speech, or at least helping with the March on Washington later on that year.
Yeah, as we'll touch on later on, again, 1963 was certainly, as you could argue, any of those years, especially from 63 to 65, but certainly 63, a tremendous amount of activity of different things going on, which we'll try to touch in the hour here on Studio 411. Quote on page 3, quote, "What mattered was doing something." Now, is that attributed to Bobby or Jack?
That's actually Bobby. Okay. Bobby was interviewed. It was during the oral histories that had been done just after the assassination in 1964. And the interviewer had asked him, or had said that a lot of people believe that John Kennedy had been the greatest civil rights president since Abraham Lincoln. What do you think about that, is basically what they asked Bobby Kennedy. And he said, if John F. Kennedy meant something, if his ideas meant anything, it meant doing something in that. It meant acting. It meant trying to make a difference in civil rights. And in fact, when Bobby Kennedy accepted the Attorney General position in 1960, just prior to the inauguration, he had a breakfast with his brother, and he was very reluctant to be Attorney General. The father especially wanted him to be Attorney General. He wanted to see him somewhere in the cabinet. John Kennedy wanted him there. He had been, while at first when they were younger, he was annoyed with his little brother. He had grown very fond of him by this point, had seen him manage not only his presidential campaign, but also the 1952 campaign for the Senate. Served with him on a couple of committees in the Senate. So he started to really take to his younger brother and saw him as a confidant. So he went to Bobby and said, listen, we are going to change the climate in this country, and I need somebody there who I can trust, who I know won't be faint-hearted, and I know that that's you. And that was the final piece that Bobby finally said, all right, let's do it. And they went outside and they announced it right there, just after that conversation.
Right after breakfast, if I recall.
Just after breakfast,
that might have been the breakfast, was the conversation. And of course, for those who don't know, their father, Joe Kennedy, had been I believe during the second or early third term of FDR, was an ambassador to Great Britain, and there was, again, brouhaha, because I think his leanings were a little almost more like, pro-Germany, if nothing else, and that caused quite.
He didn't want to get involved in World War II. That's for sure.
He didn't want, but some of the comments almost remind me of like how Lindbergh was perceived.
He was
another one that was almost like, oh yeah, they're not so bad. They're not so bad. They were marching already into Poland, and he's still trying to defend what was going on. And needless to say, I think he was hustled out of that position, and afterwards maintained a low profile. Funded the campaigns, twisted the arms and whatever, but kept a low profile. And later on, after the election, suffered a stroke, and really at that point was debilitated. So really was out of the picture totally. But there's a comment in the book about, or maybe my perception, that RFK, JFK, the two brothers, the Kennedy brothers, as referred to in one of the chapters, were reluctant civil rights advocates in 1960. Now, if you read the book, you'll understand that, again, why? As you said earlier, you have to tread very lightly. I mean, because the South is not the South of this time period we're living in now. The South is where, again, eye-opening for me, where you know, you better be flying from LA to Boston or LA to New York, because don't be traveling through Mississippi, Alabama, you know. And it even brought back memories of some neighbors I had many years ago that were African American, well educated, you know, and went to work for a couple of good companies here in Connecticut. And I was, oh yeah, why'd you move up here? And, you know, they gave the, you know, standard answer. But then I look back now after reading these books and being older and saying, geez, I think they probably left, I believe they were from Alabama. And I'm thinking, this is like now late 60s. And I'm like, after hearing about George Wallace, which I knew of, but then, what was the name? Barnett.
Barnett, yeah.
Barnett.
Ross Barnett.
And what state, correct me? Georgia?
Mississippi.
Or Mississippi. So, I mean, you know, these are pieces of work here, you know.
Yeah, and, well, the situation in Mississippi is really interesting. I had an opportunity to listen in, so to speak, of what was going on in the White House during the integration of the University of Mississippi, which ended up in riots. A few people were killed, actually, as a result of these riots. But I got an idea as to what the Kennedys were going to do about this situation in Mississippi. And they literally sent somebody from the Justice Department to set up a headquarters of sorts on the campus to get James Meredith integrated. And what I found so intriguing is that they were very active. They were very aware as to what was going on, and they did try to do something. They didn't just sit back. And one of the interesting conversations were what went on between Bobby Kennedy and Barnett on the telephone, where they would go back and forth over trying to figure out a way to get Meredith in there under some sort of charade. And they had this sort of cat and mouse routine. This is what Barnett was playing with Bobby Kennedy. And it got to the point where in one case, they had this whole situation where they were going to bring in these marshals and draw weapons on the governor to force them to integrate James Meredith. And that didn't happen.
Which they also didn't want to do, because that goes back to your point about how Eisenhower had troops or the military come out, and that usually creates you know, don't tread on me mentality amongst some of the states.
And that's an important fact too, because what a lot of people don't understand is that the last time the military was in the South, prior to the situation in Little Rock, was the Civil War.
Right.
And we're only, we're 100 years removed from the Civil War, but there are still attitudes that see Northern aggression with the use of the military in the South as unjust and as taking away rights. So the presidents at the time did tread very lightly with that, and Kennedy did not want to use the military, but he did in this case in Ole Miss, and he did in fact send in the Army, but they were slow moving, and that was part of the problem, which ended up, you know, getting people hurt and killed.
A couple of things that come to mind. One, just a brief moment on, there's a brief mention of him, and to be honest with you, I think it would be probably a good idea for a book. But again, the role, maybe not necessarily in civil rights, but certainly with all the surveillance and things, a man who, you know, if he hadn't have died, probably still would have been the FBI director. But J. Edgar Hoover, a character in more ways than one, but certainly someone that I think any president, or so I was led to believe over the years, that almost had something on everybody, to where they kind of said, you know what, hands off, just let him stay in office. And there's as a matter of fact, there's a photo of him right there. Obviously, you know, as I said, behind the scenes an interesting character, but that's for another time. But as far as FBI director, you know, I am convinced, I mean, he had surveillance on everybody, whether it was the Kennedys, certainly Martin Luther King, right up until he was assassinated. I'm not going to ask what role he played. I just think he was a guy that had his own campaign of things going on. You know? It's
an interesting dynamic, J. Edgar Hoover. Actually, Bobby Kennedy was technically J. Edgar Hoover's boss.
Right.
But
which I'm sure he didn't like.
Yeah, which he did not like. It was J. Edgar Hoover that called Bobby Kennedy to let him know that his brother had been killed in Dallas. And it was also J. Edgar Hoover who who had FBI informants in the Klan in the South. And during the Freedom Rides, there was one group that had been beaten pretty badly in Alabama, and there was an FBI undercover officer in the crowd that contributed to the beating of this Freedom Rider. So Hoover knew what was going on in Alabama before Bobby Kennedy knew what was going on in Alabama, and he probably should have communicated that to his boss, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He didn't. Yeah, he held on to things.
Yeah, that's as I said, that's a whole other big nugget to crack. So I want credit if he ever writes a book on Hoover, because I'm telling you, there's a lot of stuff. Because again, he was FBI director, I want to say mid-30s until his death.
He goes back to FDR. Yeah.
And literally, I think until the mid-70s, somewhere in there.
Well, he had been involved in the Bureau before it was the FBI since the Palmer raids of 1919. So he had been in there.
I'm trying to remember if he was even in, I believe he was still FBI director even when Watergate happened.
Was Nixon actually when he passed away.
Oh, okay, yeah. There you go. Okay, so, again, just an interesting character, but again, does come into this, and as you brought out, which I hadn't made the connection again, that Bobby was technically his boss.
Yeah.
And again, and
which I find interesting.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. JFK, RFK, the Kennedy brothers, leery of Martin Luther King. Hoover's watching Martin Luther King. I believe Hoover was watching the Kennedys too, with some of the other, extracurricular activities going on. But again, just talk about a little bit about Martin Luther King. And again, why this leeriness on the part of the Kennedy brothers?
Well, Dr. King back then, he wasn't the Nobel Prize winning inspirational leader as we know him. In 1960, he was still untested to some extent. And in fact, John Kennedy wanted Jackie Robinson to campaign for him for the presidency, and I think it was Harry Belafonte who said to John Kennedy, look, you don't want Jackie Robinson, you want Dr. King. And he was sort of on the rise when the Kennedys were in office. They were leery of him because he didn't, and this is why I respect Dr. King, he refused to wait. And he kept pressing the issue of segregation, of equality under the law. And by pressing it, he made it very difficult for the Kennedys at a time when we were at a very crisis-driven period in the Cold War. And it made us look bad to the world. And for example, when the Freedom Rides were happening in May of 1961, the Kennedys were preparing to meet with Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. And a lot of that press got out, and it made America look bad. And it put us in a bad position when we're meeting with the premier of the Soviet Union. But King needed the Kennedys, and the Kennedys needed King. Because, and I write about this in the book, you don't have the civil rights movement unless you have push from the civil rights leaders and eventual acceptance from the political leaders in this country. Because without that, you cannot get the Civil Rights Act passed. Much like Lincoln, he could not do what he did unless he had some pressure from, or unless he knew that the time was right. And for him, the time was perfect during the Civil War to free the slaves, because it wasn't only about freeing the slaves, it was about creating a cause for the people who were fighting that war, and it wasn't looking good for the North at the time. But for the Kennedys, it's a little different because they wanted to do something, but they didn't know quite how to do it. And what the civil rights leaders did was they maneuvered them into directions where they had a realization, all right, this is how we need to do it. And if you look at the integration of the University of Alabama, you see that they did it perfectly, where you have George Wallace standing in the doorway, and instead of sending in the Army, John Kennedy just took the National Guard, which George Wallace was using to keep the school segregated, and he basically federalized the National Guard. So now they took orders from Kennedy instead of taking orders from Wallace, and it was the National Guard that had to push him aside. So they learned from Ole Miss, and they learned from the Freedom Rides, and it was actually, and King is involved in all of these things in some way. Not Ole Miss, that was Medgar Evers, and even the University of Alabama was also the NAACP, not the SCLC, which was the group that King ran, but or led rather. But King is there at Birmingham, for example. And I see Birmingham as the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the civil rights movement. When you look at the Civil War, just prior to it, Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, and it exposed the brutality of slavery to the country. Now, what Birmingham does is Birmingham exposes the brutality and injustice of segregation to the country. And that's not the Kennedys, that's Fred Shuttlesworth, that's Martin Luther King, that's Ralph Abernathy, who went down there and did that. But it was up to the Kennedys to respond to it. And they do. They send Burke Marshall down to try to negotiate some sort of an agreement between the city and these civil rights leaders. And that eventually leads up to this civil rights speech where John Kennedy says that we need to look at this as a moral issue and not as a political issue. So Martin Luther King, they're leery of him, to get back to your original question, somewhat because of what J. Edgar Hoover had been sort of drumming up on Martin Luther King. He had associations with Stanley Levison, who was considered a communist. And in fact, it was at a meeting just after the speech at the White House where John Kennedy took Martin Luther King aside and said, you know, listen, they're watching you. We know about Stanley Levison, and you may want to distance yourself from him. But King, being the loyal friend that he was, refused to do that because he knew he wasn't a communist. He knew what he wanted to do was to integrate this country and bring equality to it. So he didn't do that, but King still pressed the Kennedys to act in some other way and support what they were eventually going to do, which is a march on Washington, which is what they were meeting about. And it was at that meeting, or maybe just after that meeting, they were supposed to march on the Capitol in support of the civil rights bill that Kennedy was going to put on the Hill. But it was Bobby Kennedy who said, we probably don't want to go to the Capitol because that's just going to be in the face of all these legislators. Why not go to Lincoln Memorial?
Right. Symbolism there.
And the symbolism there is great. So, and they worked with the civil rights leaders, people like Bayard Rustin, who had been involved with the Congress of Racial Equality, and Martin Luther King, and many, many others, and set this up on, you know, at Lincoln Memorial. And it's just such a historic day. And a lot of times we see that speech by Martin Luther King, which is probably the greatest speech of the 20th century, if not one of the greatest speeches in all of American history. But we oftentimes forget that a lot of stuff went on behind the scenes, and it was Bobby Kennedy and Burke Marshall that made sure some of the logistics had happened to keep it as a peaceful demonstration and not get out of hand.
Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of Civil Rights, 1960 to 1964. Adjunct Professor Philip A. Goduti Jr. Of Quinnipiac University, and also Summers High School. History, one of my favorite subjects. My mind's going in so many different directions as you bring up names and situations. On the way here to the studio, I was listening to a program which I came upon by accident. It was actually an interview with Noel Paul Stuckey and Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary fame.
Okay.
And of course they were performed at the March on Washington, which I saw a clip of that recently on television. And they had said, and I didn't know this, in December of 2014, one of the people you just mentioned, Shuttlesworth,
Fred Shuttlesworth,
just passed away.
Oh.
So yeah, so I have something on you.
Yeah.
I didn't even know that. And again, there were so many people, you know, in the civil rights movement. I mean, so many, like, you know, middle players. I mean, another gentleman whose son, I know his work, John Siegenthaler, was a big, for a brief time, was a newspaper man down in Tennessee. I don't know his background totally, but of course his son, John Jr. or John II, whatever you may know from NBC News and now Al Jazeera Television. So his son carries on the tradition. He just passed away this year as well, in June of 2014.
He was a fascinating man, John
and
Siegenthaler.
I just thought, wow, I said, you know, there's, again, a lot of stories there, because he was actually beaten at one of those assignments for Robert F. Kennedy.
Yep, and I call him, and People like John Doerr, John Siegenthaler, Nicholas Katzenbach. They're these soldiers of justice that came out of the Justice Department and were led by Bobby Kennedy. And I spent some time in the book talking about them especially. And I think it was the Christmas after John Kennedy was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy gave all of those people a picture of them, all outside of the Justice Department. And over it, it said, we happy few, we band of brothers, which is a Shakespeare quote from Henry V. And it meant to emphasize that their work was something that they saw almost as a brotherhood. Not only with civil rights, with other aspects as well, but definitely civil rights played a huge role in that feeling, as they felt like that they were contributing to something bigger. And we're doing some interesting things on the ground, in fact, just like Siegenthaler, who was trying to help out one of the Freedom Riders and ended up getting hit and knocked unconscious by one of the riders.
Yeah, and again, folks, remember, no cell phones. I mean, you're lucky if you could, you could run to a phone booth, but of course, as you're getting beaten by a policeman or whatever's going on, or by another rider in this point, or someone who's, again, gotten out of hand. Again, it's not a lot you can do. Again, there's different times. I think sometimes our younger viewers have to kind of, put themselves back there and say, okay, this is what you could do, this is what you couldn't do, not just especially in the South, but also, you just couldn't snap your finger and, oh, okay, everything was going to change. No, it just obviously took a lot of time. There was a quote here on one of the pages in the book here I just wanted to cover. There was an image a few minutes ago about John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy kind of pensively walking together. And it reminded me of this quote here. Give me 1 second here. He is the only one who doesn't stick knives in my back, unquote. So obviously, as you talked about earlier, I don't know that it was considered a big deal. I'm sure to the Republicans it was, that you were naming, your brother as like a cabinet member. I'm surprised it hasn't happened more, probably because most of the succeeding presidents, really don't have. I don't think Carter was naming Billy Bob or whatever his name. Billy Carter is, his Secretary of Defense. But anyway, at the same token, Ralph Abernathy was like Martin Luther. To me, was like Martin Luther King's Bobby Kennedy.
Lieutenant, absolutely.
And continued on that fervor, and it contained fervor, and also the spirit of Dr. King even after his assassination.
Ralph Abernathy goes back to the Montgomery bus boycott, actually, in the 1950s. He's another very interesting person. And
Rosa Parks, folks, for those of you who might have heard us talk about that.
Now, and that's to speak about people like Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, E.D. Nixon, Diane Nash, John Lewis, who's a little more well-known now because he's a congressman from Georgia.
I had forgotten that.
These are the grassroots leaders of the civil rights movement. And it's such a compelling story. And there are so many ways to see it from so many different perspectives. There's a wonderful book out by Taylor Branch called Parting the Waters, which is what I had originally read years ago on the civil rights movement. And this book, it won the Pulitzer Prize, I think, in 1988. And what Taylor Branch writes about, he does it in a narrative, basically America in the King years is what it's sort of dubbed as, but he looks at everything. He looks at everything pertaining to civil rights. And he talks about all these different people. And yes, we see Martin Luther King as the leader of the civil rights movement in the 60s. It's somewhat deceptive when you think about it, because even when you look at the Freedom Rides, they were led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality. Dr. King came around afterward, after they were holed up in First Baptist Church. And even the integration of the University of Mississippi was led by Medgar Evers, who was working for the NAACP. So these episodes in history, it just reemphasizes the fact that you need all these people in order to promote great change. And it's not something that happens overnight.
Let me just interrupt you. I took a close look at this photo real quick before it disappears. The gentleman on the left is Bill Russell. Now, I say that because obviously those of you basketball fans, great Celtic Hall of Famer. Again, I'd never seen, really couldn't tell you what his involvement, if anything, as far as civil rights movement. You figured he's playing basketball, winning all the championships, and when I was able to find that image, I thought, wow, what a great thing. And there's others, people like Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte, of course. But interesting that so many of those folks, and is for another time, eventually wound up becoming Republican. So, and I'm not quite sure why that happened later in life, but Heston he was at all these events. I mean, he was at the March on Washington, as was Brando and countless others, and I found it interesting to see the various people that really kind of stuck their necks out too. Peter, Paul, and Mary, as we discussed as well.
Well, the Republican Party originally was affiliated with civil rights, because it was the party of Lincoln. And by being the party of Lincoln, it was seen as the party that freed the slaves and tried to bring freedom to freed slaves in the South during the Reconstruction period. And that really stayed that way for a long time, until FDR, when you started seeing a shift with how he embraced African Americans with his black cabinet, which is what it was dubbed, and definitely with the Kennedys. And what you see here, and probably the best way to see this is through the electoral map, where you see a shift in voting, where the South becomes very strong Republican after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and they don't vote for Democrats in the South. If you look at the election of '64, all of those states do not vote for Lyndon Johnson, and he had an overwhelming victory.
From Texas, you would think he'd have some pull, but of course, even later on, people like Al Gore and others that you would think would carry a lot of the South, whatever, it had difficulties.
And Johnson's interesting too, because prior to his presidency, he did not embrace civil rights. He stayed away from it. He didn't even want to serve on the Equal Opportunity Commission that John Kennedy had set up, because he was afraid that it could affect him if he ran for president. Yet he gets a lot of the credit for the Civil Rights Act, largely because of his maneuvering through Congress, which he is brilliant. He is by far one of the greatest presidents.
He was a great arm twister.
Absolutely.
I don't know how he did it.
So much like the civil rights leaders needed Kennedy, and Kennedy needed them, Lyndon Johnson, he needed to be a part of this story, because without his ability to maneuver it through Congress, you don't have a Civil Rights Act of 1964. That said, you still needed the preface of it. And if you notice in that picture, that's a great picture. Bobby Kennedy's not in there. He's in the back row watching all this happen. This is in July 1964.
Actually, I think
July 2nd. The sort of the top of his hair's out there. And he had to be pushed forward in order to receive the pens for the signing of the Civil Rights Act. And he always saw it as his brother's Civil Rights Act. And Lyndon Johnson sold it as Kennedy's Civil Rights Act. And in that famous speech, he said, nothing would honor his legacy more than the passage of this Civil Rights Act. Something for which he fought so hard for so many years, something along those lines.
But I think if Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, I think that obviously I would like to think it would have still gone forward, and then I think Johnson would have been an ally then as far as doing what he did best, the arm twisting with, again, the Deep South, all the way to Texas, whatever. A lot of those folks that were more than on the fence, they were dug in pretty good. Okay, but I think that certainly would have been interesting. Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of Civil Rights, 1960 to 1964. Philip A. Goduti Jr. from Quinnipiac University, again, joining us in our remaining minutes. Again, so much to talk about. Just a couple of quick things. Jackie Robinson, again, blew my mind that, again, he endorsed Richard Nixon in 1960. I don't know. I guess.
Well, once again, that goes back to the Republican Party being seen as the party of Lincoln. And that party had a very strong African-American foundation. But you see that shift with Kennedy and Johnson, and you see it shift even further as we move into the 21st century, where now the Democratic Party is seen as the party that embraces the issues of African Americans, immigrants, the minorities in this country, which now combined have created a majority, which is really interesting to see that whole demographic switch. Where now, it's not that the minorities are the majorities, it's that a combination of all of them have now become that. And it's changed our electoral process, and it's changed how we do things in this country, which I think is amazing.
And I think is going to further change because
I completely agree.
With your Latino, Hispanic population, I think especially is going to, and we may not see it in the next 50 years, I think is going to totally change the landscape
And we
altogether.
saw it in the last two elections, absolutely.
Oh, to some degree, but I think even more than
I think it's going to go even further.
Imagine.
Absolutely.
A quick stat here, again, you were bringing up again about the progress, whatever, that has occurred, again, slow progress to many over the last 50 or 60 years, certainly more than what happened after Lincoln, whereas during that 100-year period, one could make the argument very little progress happened, but of course, you know, I think they almost use that 100th year anniversary kind of as a springboard to some of these things that were going on. Yeah. But again, African American men and or families back in, let's say, the late 50s, early 60s, I think 1 out of 200 blacks would actually go through and finish high school and or went to college and or became professional, or again, imagine 1 out of 200 actually owning a home. Now, I could say, well, Jackie Robinson, there's your one, but obviously he's a ball player, made a name for himself, again, kind of a thing where he was not, you know, living in the South, came from California, migrated, of course, to play with the Dodgers, so, you know, he had opportunities there. Folks in the States, again, Mississippi, which we always kid, you know, even to this day is always near the bottom of the list on any chart that goes on. And this is not to disparage Mississippi, it's just that old habits die hard. And believe me, when I travel in the Carolinas, and I don't even know about the deep South, I mean, I can imagine if I went down to Alabama or Georgia, I certainly hope it's changed, but there are still folks that are still very much, that are ancestors of these folks from the 60s and from the 1860s that still have some hardcore beliefs. You know, and I don't know about the governors, but as I said before, Wallace I knew about. The gentleman from Mississippi, that's a book unto itself. That gentleman, because I could not believe what I was reading. You know, and it just brought out so much in your book. So tremendous. In the remaining minutes, again, you talked about the call to Coretta Scott King. In 1960, October, which many were like, oh, why are you making that call? You know, it's a neck-and-neck race with Nixon, who, of course, we said earlier, Jackie Robinson and many others had endorsed. Eisenhower later remarked, and you talk about it in the book, that Nixon lost the election because of a couple of phone calls.
He did say that, and largely because after Bobby called the judge and actually got Martin Luther King released from prison, King didn't endorse either candidate because he needed to work with whoever made it to the presidency, and it was a very close election. There was a difference of 150,000 votes in the popular vote. It was really that close. But his father, Martin Luther King's father, endorsed John Kennedy. And prior to that, he didn't want to endorse a Catholic, which was a really big thing back then. And we forget this whole religious issue.
Absolutely.
Which was a major, major topic during the 1960 election, to the point where John Kennedy had to make a major speech on it. And his youth certainly didn't help either. So you see a shift in thinking when you have people like Martin Luther King's father, Ralph Abernathy, and other people coming out for Kennedy. And Martin Luther King just stopping short of endorsing him by saying, I've seen some promise there. And, you know, after meeting with John Kennedy prior to his election as president.
Amazing stuff. In the remaining moments we have, again, we could do another hour on this with no trouble at all. But you said earlier, obviously, the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, again, amongst others, realized, I think, later on, I don't know about John, but certainly Bobby Kennedy did, that, you know, they needed to work closer together, or even though it may not have been broadcast in public, but behind the scenes. Of course, Martin Luther King assassinated in April of '68. I remember that well, watching television. All of a sudden, a news bulletin comes, that Dr. King had been shot, and further details. Now it would be on everybody's cell phone. And of course, I remember in June, waking up to go to grammar school, and then the front page, because again, it was a 3-hour time difference in California. There's a picture of him, the famous one where obviously he's laying down in a pool of blood or whatever, and died later that next day. But again, looking back at those two men, both taken during that same year, kind of recollects for us again what you think, how almost like eerie that both would go at such a short time apart from each other.
I find it, first of all, fascinating that they had these sort of parallel lives in their careers.
And even King said in your book that when JFK was killed,
this is what's
that he knew it was almost like he knew like it hit him like a, no pun intended, like a shot, like this is what's going to happen to me.
And it was actually Bobby Kennedy had he was campaigning for the presidency when he found out that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, and he was in Indianapolis, and he made a speech to a group largely African American, informing them that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. They were hearing from him. And the speech that he gives after that is considered one of his greatest speeches. He does it off the cuff, and he just talks about what Martin Luther King meant to him, meant to the nation. And it is, it's very interesting to hear him talk about King, and then just a couple months later, unfortunately, he...
Yeah, I've seen the speech. Again, was at night, if I recall.
From the back of a pickup truck.
Yes,
actually.
yeah. And he had the megaphone similar to this again, because it was very impromptu, and again, just very, very strange. I remember in the course of not even that 6-month period, really 3-4 months, both the funerals, both the train rides, and people standing there, kind of just wanting to get a glimpse of, the train going by, and I believe one, if not both instances, and just, tremendous coverage. Again, real quick to the March on Washington speech, I was not aware. All three, again, in those days, we were lucky to have 3 major networks, folks. That was it. Carried the speech live.
Yeah.
Which, that in itself was really... again, kind of a big deal in the history of television, I think.
And John Kennedy had seen the speech, had Martin Luther King to the White House, and actually commented on it to him afterward.
Adjunct Professor Philip A. Goduti Jr. has been kind enough to join us this hour here on Studio 411. If you get a chance, check out his book, Robert F. Kennedy and the Shaping of Civil Rights, 1960 to 1964. Phil, we look forward to bigger and better things. I don't know how you're going to top this, but remember that Hoover book. I'm telling you, there's gold in those hills. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show.
A pleasure, and we look forward to having you again. That's it for now. Larry Dasilva, thanking you again for joining us this episode on Studio 411, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great week. Good night.